are. Well, listen, everybody, I am just so excited to have the privilege of introducing our first speaker for the 2024 fall series of presenters. His name is Keith Kohl. That's him right there in the dark blue shirt. And he hails from a little community of Summerfield in South Marion County. He is a living history reenactor, and in that capacity represents several periods of Florida history, the Second Civil War, the Civil War, and more recently, the 1930s gangster era. He has participated in living history reenactments throughout the eastern United States and in England. He is also an avid writer and past editor of a local Florida history magazine. In 2011, he published a full-length book, Florida Civil War Years. And I've had to change my notes because it just came up beforehand. I knew he was working on a book about the Barker-Karpis Gang, but now he's completed it and just completed it like last week. So I didn't have a chance to put it out on any of the flyers, but the title of his new book, his second book, is Flight to Florida, Last Stand of the Barker-Karpis Gang. He has a few copies out back in his truck. I know this is unplanned, but if you are interested, you can see him afterwards, or if you don't have the money, I'm sure he can tell you how to acquire it. And scope. But there's a lot in his background is about being a reenactor, but what I found most fascinating about Keith's resume is that he was one of 23,000 reenactors who took part in a 1993 movie directed by Ken Burns, The Battle of Gettysburg. And so if any of you know me, you know I'm kind of I'm into those battles. So I was very impressed when he shared that with me. Today, however, he's here to tell us about the most famous shootout in FBI history. And with that, I'll turn it over to Keith Kohl.
Okay, I'll forewarn you ahead of time. I talk fast. So if you need me to slow down, let me know. Just trying to cram as much information into the time we have. As Mr. Lee mentioned, I've been a living history reenactor since I was 14. My brother and I were already history nuts, compliments of our parents taking us to history sites all over the place. But they made the mistake when I was 14 and he was 16 of taking us to see a reenactment of the Civil War Battle of Gainesville. We were on the sidelines. I was 14, he was 16, and we were hooked. 40-some years later, here I am. So I started out in American Civil War, branched into the Second Seminole War, but how do I end up in a 1930s gangster role, especially down here in Florida? So Chamber of Commerce I used to volunteer with used to stage a reenactment of the event we're about to cover, and I was out there parking cars one year and directing traffic, and they walked up, the directors from the chamber walked up to me and said, hey, you know how to do this reenacting stuff. Well, we need an extra gunman out on the rooftop. Are you interested? Didn't take a lot of arm twisting. And into the role of Fred Barker, I stepped and played that for about 7 or 9 years. With all of that said, all the introductions over. So, excuse me, we're going to dial our clock back to the end of eventually in January 1935. It's toward the tail end of what is commonly known as the gangster era. When I mentioned the gangster era, I also tour guide at the house where the original battle took place, which is now preserved as a museum. A lot of people kind of give me the deer in the headlight look when you mention Florida and the gangster era, because certain images come to mind. Chicago, Minneapolis, big cities, back alleys, dank speakeasies, Thompson submachine guns, the Al Capones and the Dillingers of the world. Well, most people don't look at rural North Central Florida and connect it with this time period. So what would bring the gangster era down here to Florida to one of its thunderous climaxes? Well, we're not going to do a whole lot of backstory just for the sake of time, because we keep going for an hour and a half about this. But my tours last about an hour and a half. But it helps to have some background on the Barker-Karpis Gang. The Barker-Karpis Gang was one of the last of the gangster era gangs. By the time they reached their height, many of the other gangsters of that era, Capone, Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Bonnie and Clyde, have all either been brought to justice or dead or had gone underground. So the Barker-Karpis Gang was one of the last ones standing, so to speak. And, their story began basically, you could dial it back to when the Barker sons, there were four of them, the marriage of George Barker and Arizona Donnie Clark Barker, try to put that on your driver's license, had a marriage that resulted in four sons. In age of oldest to youngest, they were Herman, Lloyd, Arthur, who took the nickname of Doc, and Fred, the youngest. The boys were into trouble from about day one. They're growing up in the Depression era. They were into boyhood crimes, shoplifting, petty theft, et cetera, when the family was living in Tulsa, Oklahoma. From there, they continued just to step up. The two older boys, Herman and Lloyd, started running with a group called the Central Park Gang in Tulsa, and eventually they all branched into life of crimes of their own. You know, their mother, who started later in life taking the nickname of Kate Barker and later Ma Barker, was going to be our most controversial figure in this, because the stories have embellished over the years of just what role she really played in all of this. We'll get into that toward the end of it. When Fred Barker was at one point, all the Barker sons were either in jail and one of them was already dead. In 1927, Herman, the oldest, was involved in a store robbery in which he fatally wounded a police officer. Herman was tracked down, cornered by police, wounded himself. Rather than surrender to police, he turned his weapon on himself and ended his own life in 1927. The other Barker sons are all in prison at this point. Well, Fred Barker is serving time in a Kansas State penitentiary. While he's in there, he makes the acquaintance of another inmate named Alvin Karpis. I don't have photos of all of them, but this will give you an idea of some of the key players in this game. The one on the left is Alvin Karpis. The next one in is Fred Barker. To his right is Arthur Doc Barker, and Kate Barker to the far right. Again, Fred Barker and Alvin Karpis met while they were in prison, and they kind of made an agreement when they both got released, they would meet up on the outside and start up what would become one of the last criminal organizations of the 1930s gangster era. Fred Barker was released from prison, and a few months later, so was Alvin Karpis. Fred had already returned home to Tulsa, Oklahoma to live with his mother and her boyfriend, and Alvin Karpis joined there a few months later, and from these two men became what was one of the last gangster era gangs that they named, wait for it, the Barker-Karpis Gang, that they sat up all night coming up with the name. From what started out as store robberies, business robberies, they kept stepping up their game. By 1932, they had stepped up to high-profile bank robberies, post office robberies. The Barker-Karpis Gang became known for several factors. One, it was one of the largest gangs by the time it was done. 25 members had come and gone through its ranks. And it also became known as one of the most methodical in their planning. They planned their crimes very well. They planned their routes very well. They staged relief stations along the routes so they could change tires, fuel cans, etc., without having to pull in a gas station and get recognized. They were also known as one of the most violent. Most of your gangster era gangs, the Capones, the Dillingers, etc., you could count on one hand, less than both hands at the very most, how many law enforcement deaths could be laid at their feet. By the time the Barker-Karpis Gang was done, there could be 24 law enforcement deaths attributed to them, and that's not counting civilian casualties. In 1933, the Barker-Karpis Gang stepped up its game a little bit. They had done a series of high-profile bank robberies, post offices, payroll companies, all in and around Minneapolis, St. Paul, which is basically where their home base was. What really was a game changer for the Barker-Karpis Gang started in 1933. They decided to switch gears a little bit. Bank robberies, post office robberies, etc., could net you big hauls. They were pulling in $30,000, $40,000, $45,000 a heist, and that's $45,000 in the Depression era in 1933. That'd roughly be about $800,000 in today's money. But they decided to switch gears a little bit, and they tried a new tactic: kidnap for ransom. Pick a high-profile target, abduct him, hold him for ransom, and you can pull this heist off with less risk of getting into a gun battle with law enforcement officers, which often happened when they were doing their post office robberies and bank robberies and so forth. So they pulled off two kidnap for ransom heists, one in June 1933, another in January 1934. The second one in January 1934 really started the downfall of the gang because in one respect, they picked their target well. They picked a gent named William Ham Jr., son of William Ham, excuse me. They picked the Bremer kidnapping was the second one. They abducted Edward Bremer, son of a wealthy Minneapolis, St. Paul area businessman. He was well off himself. He was abducted, held for about 2 weeks, was ransomed off to the family for $200,000. The $200,000 ransom was paid. That's about 1.1 million in today's money, and he was released unharmed. So in one respect, it was a good target. I said, well-respected businessman, his family could afford this. On the other side of the coin, it was a bad choice. They clearly didn't do their homework enough. If you're going to pick a target, be careful not to pick a guy whose dad is a close personal friend and political supporter of a guy named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who happened to be sitting in the White House at the time. Just tightened up the radar on them, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as we know it today, did not exist by that name. It was the Department of Justice Bureau of Investigation. Federal was not added until a few months after the events that took place here in Florida. But at any rate, the Bureau of Investigation tightens up their efforts now to bring the Barker-Karpis Gang to justice. And at this point, the gang scattered. They took the ransom money they got from both kidnappings, tried to money launder it where they could, went in separate directions, and just tried to lay low and get off the radar. Some of them left the country, returned later, others scattered in various locations around the United States. That brings us to Florida. On September the 20th, 1934, 4 people show up at this location. This is the El Commodore Hotel in Miami, Florida. And 4 persons showed up on that September day using aliases. They are Alvin Karpis, Alvin Karpis's girlfriend, Fred Barker, and Kate Barker. And they check into the hotel. Karpis and his girlfriend stay less than a week, leave for Havana, Cuba. While they're staying here in Miami, Fred Barker approaches the hotel manager, a gent named Joe Adams, and so that mentions that he and his mom are just looking for a quiet little country place where they can go live the quiet country life, and just, they want to get off the radar. Joe Adams tells them, well, I know a friend, hold on. He speaks to Carson Bradford. Carson Bradford was a well-to-do Miami businessman, owner of the Key Biscayne Kennel Club, who just happened to own a little summer retreat, a little cottage, not so little actually, up in a little town in north central Florida, up in a little lakeside community called Ocklawaha, Florida. Ocklawaha is about 15 to 20 miles southeast of present-day Ocala. At first, the arrangements to rent the house were turned down. Mr. Bradford was willing, but Mrs. Bradford not so much. Understand that the average rent around this time was about $15 to $20 a month to rent a property. Barker's, using their aliases, counteroffered and said, we'll offer you $75 a month and we'll pay you several months in advance. And so that sealed the deal. And on November 1934, into this house on the north shore of Lake Weir, the booming metropolis of Ocklawaha, Florida, of a few hundred souls, moved the Blackburns. The Blackburns were the aliases being used by Kate and Fred Barker at this time. Now, this is a contemporary photograph of the house from around the 1930s. To set the stage a little bit, this is a 2-story, 2,400 square foot, 4-bedroom lakefront house with a dock and a boathouse. Bradford was doing pretty well for himself. You'll notice that it's also surrounded by a lot of trees, a lot of bushes. You can just barely make out a structure right there. The house was flanked by several smaller outbuildings, a garage, a shed, an orange grove, etc. So there was plenty of cover. This is a close-up of the house itself to give you a little better idea of what we're going to be dealing with. Now, how did federal agents find them down here in Florida? So this is a long way from Minneapolis, St. Paul, Chicago, etc., etc. Indeed, there were several events that set in motion. One of them was all the way back in March 1934. One of the gang members, a guy named George Shotgun Ziegler, got a habit of getting a little running at the mouth, and he was one of the masterminds behind the Barker-Karpis kidnappings. And The general theory was that they were afraid if he talked too much, he'd bring the authorities down on them. So in March 1934, he's exiting his favorite night spot in Cicero, Illinois, and George Shotgun Ziegler is met by a man on the street wielding a shotgun. His life is ended by the weapon he took his nickname from. They think it was members of the gang that silenced him. When the authorities showed up and searched his person, they found a notebook on his person that had names and addresses of known Barker-Karpis Gang associates. Whether this was a piece of the puzzle is still debated, but it's a plausible theory because that was March 1934. December 1934, federal agents tracked two members of the Barker-Karpis Gang, actually it was a total of 4 of them, to 2 different apartments in Chicago. On the night of January the 8th, 1935, they moved in on both apartments. At about 6:30 in the evening, Arthur Doc Barker strolls out the apartment with his girlfriend, walks straight into the hands of federal agents, and is apprehended. That night, about 10 to 10:30 p.m., they moved in on the second apartment. There were 2 gang members in it, Byron Bolton and Russell Gibson. Gibson refused to surrender despite the pleadings of Bolton and their 2 girlfriends, got into a gun battle with the federal agents and was killed. Bolton surrendered. While they were interviewing both of these men, there's several different stories that have built up over the years how they tracked them down here. There's a lot of myth and rumor that built up around this event, and we'll try and touch on some of that as we go along, but we're trying to stay focused on the main battle itself, just for time clarity. While they had Bolton in custody, 2 things led them to it. Arthur Doc Barker didn't talk much. Bolton was a little more open with the federal agents. First, he mentioned that he'd heard Arthur on the phone with whom he assumed was Fred Barker, that he and Kate were down living in north central Florida on some lake where Fred wanted to hunt some alligator named Old Joe. Well, it turned out there were 2 lakes in Florida bearing that name. What was really the final catalyst, the Old Joe part, it's a commonly told story, and it did play a piece of the puzzle. But what really was the final catalyst that brought them here to Florida, at one point, Byron Bolton, now in FBI custody, asked for a change of clothes. An agent went back to the apartment, and while he was getting clothes, they found something they missed on the first search of the apartment. They found a map atlas in a box in the closet pulled out, and Ocklawaha and Lake Weir had a red circle around it. Pay dirt. There were already federal agents in Florida based on the Old Joe tip, but they had first gone to Jacksonville. When they found this, those agents were contacted and said, forget Jacksonville, meet us in Ocklawaha. And now it almost doubled the number of agents on the ground. There were 14 agents. They started going around, passing mugshots, asking questions. When they got down to Ocklawaha, the locals looked at them and went, oh, those are the Blackburns. They're renting that house down on the lake. You know, what is largely considered, again, a lot of myth and legend and story that built up around this. What was one of the final catalysts in determining where they were and if they had any of the gang there. On January the 15th, 1935, Fred Barker is on the back dock behind the house. Most accounts say he was on the dock. There are a few that say he was on a boat on Lake Weir directly behind the house. Most had him on the dock. Either way, a fisherman approached in a boat. They chit-chatted a few minutes, went on their way. Fisherman was a federal agent. He looked at his mugshot, knew he had at least one of the Barker-Karpis gang. They do not know how many are in this house. If they'd have showed up a little sooner, they would have found more of the gang here. At this point, the house only has 2 occupants, Kate Barker and Fred Barker. But the stage is now set for the morning of January the 16th, 1935, what still remains as the longest gun battle in FBI history. To set the stage a little more, this is a sketch of the grounds of the house. The main house is right there. It's surrounded by, again, a shed, a garage, some outbuildings, the orange grove, and there's private residences flanking either side of it. Okay? So the agents surrounded, there's 14 agents on the ground. 2 of them are stationed at the roads that lead onto the property from the main highway to keep passerby from coming down. The other agents scatter around the house in groups between 3 and 5. The chief agent, E.J. Connolly, is right here by the small cottage on the corner of the property. To set the stage, they moved into position about 5:30 in the morning. By the weather almanac of the day, at sunrise, it was about 40 degrees. It would turn into a mostly sunny to partly cloudy day. The federal agents took up their positions in the pre-dawn hours and waited. At about 7:30 a.m. in the morning, the next stage in this day's drama takes place. At that point, just after sunrise, E.J. Conley approaches the house. The main door of the house faces the lake. Most accounts said he actually went up and knocked on the door. Others said he called in from the yard. Remember, they have no idea how many of the total gang members are in there. He ends up in a conversation with Kate Barker. Kate Barker, by this point, has taken the nickname of Ma Barker because she was being used as part of the boys' alias. Hey, look, we're just a traveling family. Don't pay attention. Look, even our mom is traveling with us. She comes to the door, and Conley announces to her that he has warrants for the arrest of the Barker-Karpis Gang, arrest of the Barker sons. Kate Barker cannot be charged with a crime at this point. Okay, we're going to get to her story in a little bit. She could not be charged with a crime. They were not here to arrest her. They were after her sons and the active members of the Barker-Karpis Gang. She talked with Conley for a few minutes and said something to the effect of, "Let me talk to Fred." Ducked back into the house. A few minutes go by, no response. Conley went back to the door a second time, some accounts a third time. Either way, from the time he made his initial challenge until his answer came, was reported at 12 to 15 minutes. At this point, all the agents are waiting in positions around it, armed with Thompson submachine guns, shotguns, rifles, assorted pistols, and tear gas grenades. So after 12 to 15 minutes after his initial challenge, Conley gets his answer. At one point, there was a voice from inside the house that said, "All right, go ahead." The agents took this as, okay, they're going to walk out and surrender. Nothing like that. And now, if you'll notice the arrow pointing to the near corner bedroom window, 12 to 15 minutes after Conley made his initial challenge, he got his answer. Fred Barker appears at an upstairs window, snaps the bolt back on a Thompson submachine gun, opens fire. Bullets hit all around Conley, do not strike him. He ducks for cover, and the longest gun battle in FBI history is on. The town of Ocklawaha is now waking up to a sound many of them probably never heard before, the chatter of a Thompson submachine gun. For the first 45 minutes to an hour, this was described as an all-out war. The agents initially responded with tear gas grenades, but were not able to get them in through the windows. They switched to small arms fire. At one point, they reported they were getting gunfire from an upstairs window and a downstairs window simultaneously. They knew there were at least 2 active shooters in the house. Now, Kate Barker can be charged with a crime, assault on a law enforcement officer. But for the first 45 minutes to an hour, it is described as an all-out war. It's the two sides furiously exchanged gunfire with each other. After that first hour, the scene went quiet for a moment. And then a series of events happened that every 12 to 15 minutes or so, the agents would cease fire, but then something would happen. A curtain would blow, a shadow would move by the window. The agents would open fire on it. It would trigger a salvo of 12 to 15 minutes, go quiet again. And this was the nature of it after that first hour. 15 minutes of fire, 15 minutes of quiet, repeat, 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 until 4 hours had gone by after the initial exchange of gunfire. Later, the agents would reply that they didn't remember getting any return fire after the first hour, but when they'd see movement in the house, they knew the nature of the gang inside that house. None of them were really willing to just stick their head inside the door. So after 4 hours, the scene finally goes quiet. Again, the federal agents are hesitant to stick their head in the door. So how do you break the standoff? During the exchanges of fire and during those on and off moments of firing, federal agents were moving around the house looking for better vantage points. They entered one of the outbuildings. Some accounts say it was the cottage, some say it was the garage and shed. Either way, who do they find huddled on the floor? Mr. and Mrs. Willie Woodbury, an African-American couple that had been local people that had been hired by the Barkers to service the cook, the housekeeper, the gardener, et cetera, et cetera. They were present when the battle took place, made for that outbuilding, huddled down on the floor to take cover from the hail of bullets. After the gun battle was over, they had to break the standoff somehow, so the agents got an idea. Yo, Mr. Woodbury, come over here. Call over Willie Woodbury. Asked him basically to go inside the house on the theory that since the Barkers knew him, maybe they wouldn't take it out on him. He could enter the house safely. Other accounts, many, many years later, Willie Woodbury lived until the late 70s, early 80s. In one of his later newspaper reports, he mentioned that, well, the agents offered me $20 to go in. Whichever the actual story was, Woodbury was fitted with a bulletproof vest, entered the house. He was in there about 10 to 15 minutes, and the agents were starting to wonder what had happened. Had the Barkers abducted him? Were they holding him as a hostage? After about 15 minutes went by, Woodbury appeared at that upstairs bedroom window where the arrow was pointing and announced that both of the occupants of the house were dead. At this point, the federal agents moved in. To give you an idea of what they found when they got inside the house. Now, again, stories and numbers vary. Some accounts say that a FBI investigator went and accounted for 700 bullet holes inside the house. The federal agents themselves, however, 4 different federal agents attested in reports effort that between all of them, they fired 1,500 rounds of ammunition into this house. When they got inside, they have to look closely. If you notice the lamp on the table, look above it on the wall. You can see the bullet holes in the wall. The window to the left has been blown out by small arms fire. Yeah, and remember this picture because we're going to come back to it. This is another wider shot of that same wall. You'll notice that throughout the firing, never touched the lamp. So remember those lamps. Don't remember because the lamp on the table and on the wall survived it. This is one of the upstairs corner bedrooms. If you look very carefully, you'll see a track of bullets in the wall. These are original photographs taken by federal agents after the fight was over. This is the bedroom where the bodies were found. That window where you saw with the arrow pointing to it, this was the interior of that bedroom. Kate Barker's body was found right there in front of that door. Fred Barker was a matter of dispute. Some put him under the corner windows where this picture is being taken from. Others had his body just out in the hallway. Kate Barker, again, a lot of stories about her were a matter of conjecture. She was reportedly found by one account with a single gunshot wound to the head, raising the question, was it a lucky hit? Did Fred do it, or was it self-inflicted? Other accounts say she had 3 gunshot wounds to the head. Fred's body was found in the corner with 14 gunshot wounds, 3 to the head, 11 across the chest and torso, where he apparently got raped by a Thompson machine gun. But this is what they also found inside the house. This is the Barker's arsenal. They found 2 Thompson submachine guns, 1 pump action shotgun, 1 automatic shotgun, 1 lever action rifle, bulletproof vests, assorted handguns, boatloads of ammunition. The Barkers were ready for a fight if it came. Now, while this is going on, townspeople gathered to watch it, and only now are realizing that for the past 2.5 months, 2 of the most wanted gangsters, or one of the most wanted gangsters and an accomplice, were living quietly in their midst for the past 2.5 months. And the bodies were taken from here into Powell's mortuary in Ocklawaha. Powell's mortuary no longer exists. It is now the Southside Deli, not too far from the main post office in downtown Ocklawaha, but the building still exists. The bodies were taken there, and the enterprising mortuary owner got an idea that, hey, I've got 2 of the most wanted and most infamous people in the country now. He reportedly laid them out in public view and charged a nickel. Come through and see the famous gangsters. Reportedly, so many people came through. It wore out the carpet in front of the viewing windows. Federal agents were reportedly also there watching the place in case any other gang members showed up to confirm if the Barkers were dead, they would be apprehended at the same time. None of them showed up. Word got around within a day or 2. Barker-Karpis and Harry Campbell, another gang member, are back at the Ocklawaha Hotel in Miami. They quickly leave there, head to Atlantic City, where they are tracked down a few weeks later, engage in a gun battle in the hallway with federal agents. Both men escape. All the members of the Barker-Karpis gang would eventually be either killed. Remember, Herman's already dead. The others were in prison, went underground, etc. So all of them were eventually brought to justice or died. All of the Barker sons died violent deaths. Fred died here. Herman took his own life in 1927. Arthur Barker was arrested later and imprisoned in Alcatraz in 1939. He attempted a prison break and was killed by guards at the waterfront. The last remaining Barker son, Lloyd, went straight after he served a prison sentence for post office robbery, did a 2-year hitch in the U.S. Army during World War II as a short order cook in a POW camp, and went straight and never went back to his life of crime. Ironically, he also died a violent death. He was got a frantic call from his wife, Jenny, to come home on a day in 1949. Hurried home. He was living in Aurora, Colorado at the time. Hurried home. Coming up the steps, he is met by his then found to be mentally unstable wife, Jenny, who ends his life with a shotgun on the front steps of their house. So this gun battle effectively ended the reign of the Barker-Karpis gang. Never, they had already scattered. Never again did they reunite and function as the well-oiled criminal organization that they had before. Now, the house. This is a view of the house from several years ago on its original site in Ocklawaha. It continued to be owned by Carson Bradford's family for many years. The land was eventually sold and said it was not open to the public. They allowed them to use it in 1985 on the 50th anniversary when the Chamber of Commerce in Ocklawaha reenacted the gun battle. The Bradford family allowed them the use of the original house. It was during this that I crossed paths with the Ocala police chief at the time, a guy named F. Lee McGee. His dad was the assistant undertaker who removed the bodies from the house. He made this kind of his life study, and I'm indebted to him because conversations I had with him shed a lot of light on the myth and legend that grew up around this gun battle. There were outlandish stories all the way to the point that the federal agents tracked them to Ocklawaha because Fred was on the back docks hunting ducks with a Thompson submachine gun. But this is the house as it appeared on its original site. The land was sold by the Bradford family in 2016, but the sale included the land. It did not include the house. They offered the house to the Marion County government to preserve it as a museum with one requirement. You had to move it off the property. We're looking at a 2,400 square foot, 2-story, 4-bedroom house. But this triggered a grassroots operation between the Marion County government, a citizen support organization, donations from the communities, et cetera, enough funds were raised to move the house. They couldn't move it overland because the tree canopy was too small and the roads were too narrow. So they came up with this idea, lake. It sits right on the north shore of Lake Weir. On the south side of Lake Weir was Kearney Island, Marion County Park and Recreation Area. Plenty of acreage, so enough money was raised. An engineering company from Ocala was retained. They secured the house, rolled it onto a barge. You can see the dock just in the left corner that they built to get it there, and floated it 2 miles across Lake Weir in about a 30-minute journey to Kearney Island Park. And now it rests there. For a while, it was closed as upgrades were done, but now it has been open to the public for tours. Right? So there's the house as it stands today in Kearney Island Park. They set the house almost, they tried to match the distance from the lakeshore to the house. It sits a little higher off the ground. They had to put a new foundation under it. But in most respects, this house is literally a 1935 time capsule. Most of the furniture is original. There's the upgrades over the years that the Bradford family lived in. They used it for another 80 years after that. Of course, there were upgrades, modern electricity, modern air conditioning, hot water heater, et cetera, but by and large, it appears very much as it did on that day in 1935. Now, if you remember this picture from a little while ago of all the bullet holes in the wall, this is the present day picture of it. If you look very carefully, there's the 2 lamps. The original lamps are still in the house that survived the gun battle. If you look very carefully in the left corner, you can see patching plaster on the wall where the bullet holes were patched up. This is the upstairs, one of the corner bedrooms. And again, if you look in there, you can just barely make out a track of bullets. There's the same today. I said most of the bullet holes have been patched, but a few are still visible. This is the room where the Barker's bodies were found and the present day view of the same. So now, in the same room, that chair is a remnant from the original battle. When I first went in the house many years ago, the bullets were actually still in it. They were removed only when the Park Service got it. And for many years, Lake Weir Chamber of Commerce staged their annual reenactment of it. And this is one of the few photos I had. I was up there on the rooftop getting shot at. I didn't get a lot of pictures, but the federal agents were played by Marion County Sheriff's deputies. Local person donated the old car. And for many years, for about 7 to 10 years, this event went on recreated in Ocklawaha annually. Now, our most controversial figure in all this, again, was Kate Barker. What was the final story on her? Depending on who you ask. Stories grew over the years that Kate Barker was this criminal mastermind, that she was the brains behind the gang. She planned their heist, ruled it with an iron fist. Again, the stories got really outlandish about this event in a lot of ways. Remember what I said, most federal agents accounted they fired about 1,500 rounds at this house. Over the years, the stories have grown. It was 2,000 rounds, 3,000 rounds. I've heard it as high as 4,000. So Kate Barker's role in all of this, I mean, it depends on who you ask. The stories got crazy enough about her that there were rumors going around that Kate Barker was running a training camp in a school for criminal masterminds. Now, some of this story did get embellished in some ways by the federal agents, because there were reports that Kate Barker's story was growing, and in some ways they just went along with it, because if they caught Kate Barker, wrong place, wrong time, she got killed in an exchange of gunfire, it wouldn't look like they just gunned down an innocent civilian. She already had a reputation. If you ask the actual gang members, they said Kate Barker was a simple woman. She did not get involved in the planning of their heist. The boys tried to keep her out of the loop as much as they could when they planned their heist. And one of the gang members said of her, well, what was Kate Barker really like, and what was her role in all of this? They said, Kate Barker, quote, couldn't plan breakfast, let alone pull off a major heist. So, but today the house remains. Now it is open to the public. It's in the hands of the Marion County Park Service. It is open for tours on specific weekends. They're getting a little better about it now since they've had more volunteer tour guides sign on. I've been doing it about a year now. When I first came on, the waiting list was about a year out with 700 names on it. We've been whittling that down for years. That is the legacy of the longest gun battle in FBI history. The time capsule where it all took place still stands. And now, if there's any questions, I will give them my best shot.
First of all, Pete, I just want to thank you for the job well done. So how should they explain a little bit more about if somebody wanted to visit the house, how do they go about doing it?
Your best bet for that is you have to register in advance for it and reserve spots. And you can either do that by calling the main office of the Marion County Parks and Rec Department. When you get their cute little computerized menu that we all have to deal with these days, if you want this, press 1. If you want this, press 2. There is an entry, I think it's option 6. They'll say is, if you want to reserve a Mom Barker house tour, the other option is to register for it through their website with the Marion County Parks and Rec Department. I want to say it's marioncountyparksandrec.org, but I'm not certain. But any good internet search for Marion County Parks and Rec will find it.
And the cost?
It's $10 a head. Say again? The wait. Right now, I'm not sure, because we've been whittling that down. At one point, there were only 2 or 3 volunteer tour guides. Now there's 7 or 8 of us. I can only do weekends because I still work Monday, Friday, 8 to 5. The others are all retired. But we've been whittling that down. I think they've gotten it down to possibly 2 or 3 months now, if even that.
My wife and I did it last spring. We only waited about 30 days.
30?
It's terrific. Can't recommend it highly enough, particularly Pete's. Yeah.
With the bullet holes that are fixed, is that done by the family?
Yes, just remember that they lived in this house another 80 years, and to the best of my knowledge, they were really, really careful about ever renting it out again. But yes, there was they patched all the bullet holes, they replaced the shattered windows, because they were going to live in this house almost another 80 years. And the family continued to live in it. And my first involvement with the reenactment was that I was just parking cars. And a gent walked up out of nowhere. I was out there in this field directing traffic. And a gent walked up and he said, "I understand you're a history buff." And I said, "Yes, sir." He goes, "Take a walk with me." The Chamber of Commerce site was directly across the street from the original house location. The man who walked up to me was Carson Bradford's great grandson. He said, "Take a walk with me." Walked me across the street and I got my personal tour of the house. So the Bradford family continued to live in it all the way up until 2016 when it was sold. So over the years that they patched all the bullet holes, replaced the shot out windows, et cetera, et cetera. And when I actually went in the house the first time, all those bullet holes you saw, the tracks in the wall, were reopened after it moved. When I first went in the house, I saw only 2 bullet holes in the house, and he pointed out, he pulled that wooden chair away from the wall and pointed to the bullet holes. And then he said, "Turn the chair around," and there were the slugs buried in the back of that plain wooden chair that was in one of those pictures. Every other bullet hole had been patched. And he said they had to return it to livable condition after getting 1,500 rounds of ammo plowed into it. Yes, ma'am.
Were local authorities involved very much in that?
Not in the event, the combat, the battle itself.
But in the phone.
There were Marion County, to the best of my knowledge, there were Marion County sheriff's deputies in the area, just doing traffic control. But they did not get involved in the actual fight itself.
Were there any suspicions raised by locals when these people from out of town, in a very small town, showed up with money and?
Yes and no. And again, it's a good question. And here we're going to get into some of the myth that built up around this. Because you're looking at, when they first came in, they were just largely regarded as eccentric Northerners. It's a mother and son pair. They just wanted to lay low. The things that drew attention for the eccentricities, we'll start with Kate Barker. She fell in with a local, she got involved with a local church, but she was known for dropping larger than usual donations that you might expect in the offering plate in a little country town in 1934. She would reportedly sometimes go down to the local general store, buy a few items, hand the shopkeep a $20 bill. There was a $20 bill in 1934. Reported some of the shopkeep didn't have enough to make change. He had to close up and go get change for it. There were other stories that, Fred Barker always kept the vehicle fueled at any point. Some people reported hearing sound of a police scanner in his Buick. All kinds of stories. People came and went at weird hours from the house. Other townspeople disputed that. And they said, by and large, they were just regarded as eccentric Northerners. Nothing really tipped them off. I take the story about Fred Barker hunting ducks with a Thompson as complete fallacy. By and large, until the day that gun battle happened, they just regarded them largely as eccentric Northerners. So,
And so the father or the mother and the son were there, what the other members have come and gone at a time and visited them, or?
if the federal agents had arrived, depending which account you read, anywhere from 6 to 10 days earlier, they would have found several. They would have found Barker-Karpis had been there, Harry Campbell had been there, a couple of other members had come and gone. But at the time that the battle happened, all of them had left the house except those two.
So they weren't necessarily just hiding out, they could have been still planning stuff and.
Pretty much, they were the Barker-Karpis gang by this point, as far as planning places were pretty much done. If they were actually in there when Campbell came to visit Karpis, if they were actually planning anything, it was never disclosed. And because after the heat came down on them from the Bremer kidnapping, I said they were trying to lay low as much as they could for a while. Yeah, who would have ever expected 1935 gangsters in this tiny little lakeside farm town? Okay. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Were there any estimates made at what point during this 4-hour battle they actually killed him? Or they just shooting it?
By most accounts, the federal agents, now they don't have any way to verify this, but the federal agents later stated that we believe after the first hour, they were probably dead. Based only on this, they did not recall any return of fire after that first hour. What the agents were shooting at was movements they saw inside.
Yeah.
And they would see something move by the window, a curtain blow, a shadow move, and they would open fire on it, not knowing, were they still alive in there, just out of ammunition? They didn't know what was going on. So they were firing at movement, but they didn't recall any return fire. So most of them they were surmising that they were dead after the first hour. But the only thing they have to go on is the lack of return fire.
So Keith, again, you've done a great job, but I understand that next weekend you'll be in Palaca at the Bronson Mulholland House for the reenactment of the occupation of Palaca.
Yeah, I switched gears.
Go back to the Civil
I go from the 1930s to the 1860s.
So that's a 2-day event. Was it Friday and Saturday?
Well, Friday is mostly open for school tours. They're busing like 800 school kids. And then Saturday, Sunday, it's open to the public.
Okay, so it's actually Saturday and Sunday for the public.
Yeah, they used to be just Friday and Saturday. They've expanded it to include Sunday.
I just want to throw that out. There should be anybody. Yes. Very good. Thank you so much.
Well, I said, I'll hang around a few minutes if any questions come up that didn't get brought up during this. And other than that, thank you.
Thank you.